He was born in Recife, the state of Pernambuco, in an area that was always considered very poor, with the exception that Recife in the Northeast was considered the cultural capital of the Northeast, and the whole struggle against slavery was fought and won in Recife. So there is some antecedents of what Freire may have understood about a progressive model of education. He created a system, and in that system, a particular way of teaching literacy training. If one understands literacy training as he did, is the construction of citizenship. Not only because people need to be qualified to make political choices, to be good citizens, but also because at the time in Brazil, we are looking at 1961, 62, people who couldn't read and write your own name will not be able to vote. So it was an exclusionary model. So who voted? People who were educated and the owners of land that will manipulate the workers. So Brazil had a very fragile democracy. What Freire did, created an accelerated process. He experimented. He was working at the University of Recife at the time. He experimented with different strategies and created a very accelerated process of obtaining basically citizenship by allowing people in 40 or 50 hours of work, literacy training, to learn how to read and write their own names, and much more. In the end, the system that he created in this short period of time facilitated that people will learn the basic literacy and numeracy, reading, writing, arithmetics of second grade in primary school. Now, he was so successful that the government of the time was a populist government of João Goulart, decided to celebrate his work and created a commission called Popular Culture, which was an attempt to expand citizenship by creating more of this model that Freire have created in a particular town in Anjicos in northeast Brazil. At the turn of this century, the University of London decided to work through Google to see which are the books of social sciences more quoted or referenced in the world. So looking at Google, they discovered that there were several books. Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Press was the number 3rd book most quoted in the world in social sciences, the first book most quoted in education. So that book, which has been translated in over 40 languages, in English alone, last time I checked, have sold more than 500,000 volumes, is still a reference for a number of things, including models of political analysis, models of philosophical analysis, models of epistemology, etc. So why Freire? Very simply because I will argue that for the 20th century, vis-a-vis education, there are 2 philosophers that mark the whole century. In the first half, obviously, is a philosopher that worked around new principles of education, progressive education, John Dewey, an American scholar who had participated during a very long life in many different new models of transformation. He went to the Mexican Revolution, he went to the Chinese Revolution. He was very active trying to promote new models, now known as the New School. And in the second half, certainly was Freire. between the two of them, you have the most significant contributions to education in the 20th century. Before he passed away, he and I have discussed doing a book of dialogues between him and I on the currency of Paulo Freire for the 21st century. He passed away before we couldn't do that, few years before the turn of the century. So I thought, well, okay, this is an opportunity we couldn't have with Paulo. Let's do it with people who have studied Paulo Freire. There is a scholarship on Freire in the world. So I accepted, and I began to select the different authors. And I did it in such a way that my presence as facilitator kind of disappeared. I wanted to be in the background. I didn't want to impose my ideas to the people that have been studying Freire throughout their whole life. So the narrative in the book is this. Today in pedagogy, we can be with Freire or against Freire, but not without Freire. That's a very generic argument, but it's an argument that facilitates understanding of a work that have impacted the life of so many people. If you really look at the history of Latin America, I'm a Latin Americanist, I work on education as well, but it's been part of my tradition, I work in other fields as well. If you really look at the time in Latin America, the 60s was a revolutionary time. It was a time in which people decided to change reality and understood education for social transformation. In a sense, a term that Freire himself coined, education for liberation. So it was connected with 4 different traditions, which Freire, in many different ways and emblematically, represents. The first one is theology of liberation from the Catholic and Protestant churches, which is an attempt to dissociate, to divorce the institutional churches from the power that be. We cannot avoid to recognize that the history of the incorporation of the Catholic churches, and to some extent the Protestant churches, I'm not talking about evangelical churches. The evangelical churches came much later. In Latin America was always connected with the elites, with the power. Freire, in a way, as well as any model of theology of liberation, was challenging that. And to put it in a way that I like very much, the Jesuits put it in this sense: the preferential option for the poor. The preferential option for the poor. And that itself created communities throughout the region that were trying to understand this new theology as kind of emerging from the roots of the tradition, but emerging from the roots of the people. The second and very important movement was what we call now in social sciences dependency theory. And dependency theory, which was very important because it contrasted the notion of dependency and development, was an attempt to show that the colonizers, and particularly the dominant countries in the world, have created conditions for which some other people will not develop because they were dependent. At best, you can have dependent development, but not the kind of development that you see in the tradition of England or the US, Germany, before the war, etc. The third great tradition was the tradition of philosophy connected with liberation, a philosophy of liberation. This was an attempt to correct the problems with enlightenment, which there are many, including strong racism in many of the Enlightenment philosophers, and B, to try to figure out what are the ethos, what are the roots of Latin American thinking. And finally, you have popular education. popular education, which also Freire not only embraced, but redefined, and I don't have the time to explain that today, came from radical trends in Europe, meaning by that socialism, communism, anarchism, and these trends were so radical because they wanted to confront the hegemony of the elites that prevented the working class to obtain sufficient education. So the whole argument from this tradition was we need to give access to education to the working class, even if that culture that they will access will be the hegemony of the elites, assuming that the working class will in itself modify that hegemony. In synthesis, Freire become a synthesis, if I may repeat myself, of all of these traditions. And that is what was so powerful. Finally, I will say he has read most of the fundamental pieces of European philosophy. And he deconstructed that European philosophy and created an original perception. Let me put it in this way, and with this I will stop. Freire knew how to write music. If this metaphor is good, I tell you this. When you read Freire, it's like you are reading a music that you have heard before, but nobody has written it yet. There was something in Freire that encapsulated that extraordinary original ideas of putting together things that we have heard before, and now in a new symphony. And that new symphony impacted the life of people and impacted the process of social transformation, revolution, particularly in some areas, adult education, but other areas as well in social sciences. This book was structured in the following way. There is a long introduction that I wrote, contextualizing Freire and the book. And there are 12 chapters on the history connected with Freire. And other places, there is a chapter on Freire in the US, Freire in China, Freire in Asia, Freire in Latin America. The second section is Freire and the epistemology of the global South. Then there is another section on contemporary elements, how Freire is useful for the construction of democratic education. And I think that is what makes this book so relevant, so current. We are now struggling to defend liberal democracy. How education contributes to democracy was always an important question, never so important as of today. I think we are now going to see another wave worldwide of, I wouldn't call it revolution, but rebellion against neopopulism.